I never thought I'd live in a neighborhood where the local homeowners association would treat grown adults like middle school students under a curfew. Yet, here I was, standing on the porch of my own house, holding a letter that practically boiled my blood. The letter had come earlier that morning, slid neatly into my mailbox with the HOA's tacky letterhead stamped across the top. It read, "All residents are hereby prohibited from being outdoors past 8 p.m., unless special permission is granted by the HOA board. Violations of this rule will result in disciplinary action." Disciplinary action. What were they going to do? Ground me? Take away my TV privileges? I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of poorly written joke. But then I saw the rest of the notice. It wasn't a joke. The HOA claimed that the curfew was for the safety of the community, citing vague concerns about rowdy nighttime behavior and loitering near homes. But I knew the truth. This was just another power grab, another ridiculous overreach from the small group of board members who thrived on controlling everyone else's lives. And at the center of it all was Karen Whitfield. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her: short blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and a permanent scowl plastered across her face. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the one who had bullied her way into being the board president. If she could control when people mowed their lawns, what color their shutters were, and even which cars were allowed in the driveways, then of course she'd push for something as insane as a curfew. I remember standing there on my porch, rereading the notice over and over, until anger started to bubble up inside me. Who did they think they were? Telling me, a full-grown adult, that I couldn't step outside my own home after dark. This wasn't a gated community for teenagers. This wasn't even legal, as far as I knew. It was my property, and the sidewalk in front of it was public land. I wasn't about to be intimidated. So I made a decision right then and there. I was going outside after 8 p.m. Not because I had to. Not because I needed to. But because no one, especially not a power-drunk HOA president, was going to dictate what I could or couldn't do with my own time. The setup. That evening, I kept glancing at the clock. 7:30 p.m. 7:45 p.m. 7:55 p.m. I felt like a teenager again, daring to break curfew, except this time the people I was defying weren't my parents. They were supposed to be my neighbors, grown men and women who should have had more important things to do than babysit the entire neighborhood. I grabbed a hoodie, slid on my sneakers, and sat by the window, waiting. 8 p.m. The digital clock on my oven blinked in silence. The neighborhood outside was eerily quiet. Normally, you'd hear kids laughing, maybe someone grilling in their backyard, or a dog barking in the distance. But tonight, it was different. The HOA's new rule had scared people. No one was outside. The sidewalks were empty. The streetlights hummed over a ghost town. And that's exactly how Karen wanted it. Well, I wasn't going to play along. I opened my front door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool, the kind of crisp breeze that makes you breathe deeper, just to feel alive. For a moment, I stood there, arms folded, just looking around at the quiet street. Nothing happened. I took a step down the walkway. Still nothing. I started walking toward the sidewalk, feeling almost silly for expecting someone to leap out of the bushes and shout at me. But then I saw it, movement from across the street. The watchers. 3 shadows stood near the corner, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. At first, I thought it was just some neighbors out for a walk, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized they weren't walking. They were standing. Watching. HOA enforcers. Yes, that's what they called themselves, the so-called community safety volunteers. In reality, they were just Karen's little gang of rule enforcers, wannabe security guards, who carried clipboards and flashlights like they were patrolling a prison yard. One of them spoke into a walkie-talkie. Another pointed in my direction. I smirked. Of course. Karen had actually sent people out to spy on the neighborhood, just to make sure everyone was obeying her ridiculous curfew. Well, let them watch. I wasn't breaking any real law. I strolled casually down the sidewalk, hands in my hoodie pocket, as if I didn't even notice them. But the truth is, my heart was pounding. Not from fear, but from the realization that I was about to become a target. And I was right. Because only a few minutes later, they started moving toward me. The approach. "Excuse me, sir," one of them shouted, jogging across the street. His reflective vest looked like something he'd ordered off Amazon, and his flashlight beam bounced around like he thought it made him look official. "You're in violation of HOA policy. You need to return to your home immediately." I stopped and turned to face him. "Violation? It's 8 o'clock, not midnight. And even if it was midnight, you don't have the authority to tell me when I can step outside my own house." The man looked flustered. He wasn't expecting pushback. His two buddies came up behind him, standing shoulder to shoulder like backup dancers in a bad play. "It's a safety protocol," another one said, puffing out his chest. "All residents are required to comply." "Required by who?" I shot back. "You?" "Karen. The HOA doesn't outrank the police, and last I checked, we live in America, not a boarding school." That one hit a nerve. Their faces tightened, and I could tell they didn't like being reminded of their lack of actual authority. But before I could say anything else, I heard the sound of heels clicking against pavement. And then, emerging from the shadows like a villain in a cheap drama, came Karen Whitfield herself. Karen arrives. Her arms were crossed, her face twisted into that smug smile she wore whenever she thought she had the upper hand. "Well, well, well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I knew someone would try to break the rules. I should have guessed it would be you." I clenched my jaw. "Karen, you can't make up fake curfews and expect people to bow down to them. This isn't legal." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't start with the legality argument. This is about community order. If you don't like the rules, maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you." I took a step closer. "You don't own me. You don't own this street. And you sure as hell don't own the Constitution. I'll go outside whenever I damn well please." Her smile faded. She snapped her fingers at her little squad like she was a mob boss. "Boys," she said. "Escort him back home." And just like that, the tension skyrocketed. Because when they took a step forward, I knew this wasn't going to end with words. This was about to get physical. The three volunteers shifted their stance, trying to look intimidating. They weren't security guards, they weren't police. They were just neighbors playing dress-up with reflective vests and cheap radios. Still, the way they squared their shoulders made it clear they weren't planning on letting me walk away. One of them, the tallest, jabbed a finger in my face. "You heard the board president. Curfew's in place. You can either head back inside peacefully, or we'll escort you." I stared at him, incredulous. "Escort me? To my own house? You've got to be kidding me." Karen's lips curled into a smirk. She loved this, her little private army doing her bidding. She folded her arms and added, "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We set rules for a reason." I couldn't help but laugh, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that came from humor, it was the bitter kind, the one that slips out when frustration boils over. "You set rules to feel powerful. And you know what? I'm done playing along. I'm walking. And with that, I turned my back on all of them and started down the sidewalk. The first shove. I didn't get more than 3 steps before I felt a hard shove between my shoulder blades. I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before I fell face-first onto the concrete. Hey! I spun around, fists clenched. The tall guy was standing there, chest puffed out, a smug grin spreading across his face. "You don't walk away from the HOA," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "We told you to get back in your house." That's when something snapped inside me. These weren't concerned neighbors. They weren't keeping anyone safe. They were bullies, grown men trying to push me around, because they thought Karen's title gave them power. And bullies only understand one thing. I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "Touch me again, and you'll regret it." Karen fans the flames. Of course, Karen couldn't keep her mouth shut. "Oh, stop being dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes. "If you would just obey the rules, none of this would be happening. You're the problem here, not us." She tilted her chin toward her goons. "Handle it." That was it. Permission granted. The second enforcer, a stockier guy with a flashlight clenched in his hand, lunged forward and grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, like he thought he could just drag me home like a misbehaving child. Reflex took over. I twisted my arm free, pivoted on my heel, and shoved him back with both hands. He stumbled, nearly dropping his flashlight, his face shocked that I didn't just submit. "You can't touch me," I barked. "This is assault. You understand that? You put your hands on me again, and I'll defend myself." For a moment, there was silence. Even Karen froze, her eyes widening at my words. Maybe they hadn't expected resistance. Maybe they thought I'd fold the second they raised their voices. But instead of backing down, the tall guy stepped forward again, this time, swinging his arm like he was going to grab me by the collar. That was his mistake. The first punch. I ducked under his arm and drove my fist square into his chest. The air whooshed out of him, and he staggered backward, coughing, clutching his ribs. His 2 friends immediately rushed forward, but adrenaline was already coursing through me. The stocky guy tried to swing his flashlight like a club. I blocked it with my forearm, gritting my teeth at the sting, then shoved him sideways into a hedge. The third one, nervous, thinner, clearly not used to fighting, froze for a second too long. I took a step toward him, and he immediately raised his hands in surrender, backing away. The entire street echoed with Karen's shrill voice. "Assault! Assault! He's attacking us! Get him!" But no one else came. The rest of the neighborhood was shut away inside, blinds pulled, lights off, probably peeking through curtains, but too scared to intervene. It was just me, Karen, and her 3 wannabe enforcers, and I wasn't about to lose. Escalation. The tall guy recovered enough to lunge at me again, this time more desperate. He wrapped his arms around my torso, trying to wrestle me to the ground. I planted my feet, twisted, and slammed my elbow into his side. He yelped and let go. The stocky one charged again, flashlight raised high, aiming for my head. Instinct screamed, and I ducked just in time, the heavy plastic barely missed my temple. I grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisted hard, and ripped the flashlight out of his grip. Now I was holding the weapon. I didn't even have to use it. Just swinging it down at the pavement, with a loud crack, was enough to make them all flinch backward. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the empty houses. "You lay another hand on me, and I'll make sure every one of you spends the night in jail." For the first time all night, Karen's smug confidence wavered. Her mouth opened and closed like she was scrambling for the right words. But before she could speak, I made my move. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Karen's panic. The moment she saw me put the phone to my ear, Karen snapped out of her shock. "No. Put that down," she screeched, storming closer. "You can't call the police on your own neighbors. This is a community matter, we handle these things internally." I held up a hand to silence her, listening as the operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? "Yes," I said clearly, making sure Karen and her little squad heard every word. "I'm being physically attacked by members of my HOA for walking outside after 8 p.m. They've shoved me, tried to drag me home, and threatened me with weapons. I need officers here now." The line went quiet for a beat, then the operator replied firmly, "Units are on the way. Stay where you are." Karen's face drained of color. Her enforcers suddenly looked less like tough guys, and more like kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "You," she stammered, pointing at me, "you're going to regret this. The HOA doesn't answer to the police." I smirked, slipping the flashlight into my pocket as evidence. "We'll see about that." The waiting game. The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Karen paced back and forth, muttering angrily under her breath, while her enforcers hovered nearby, torn between defending her and preparing excuses for the police. I stayed right where I was, leaning against the lamppost, phone still in my hand. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The law was on my side now, and Karen knew it. When the sound of sirens finally pierced the quiet night, Karen's composure shattered completely. She spun on her heels, barking orders at her squad. "Don't say a word. Do you hear me? Not one word until I talk to the officers." But it was too late. The cavalry was here. The shriek of sirens cut through the still night air, red and blue lights flashing across the darkened houses. Curtains twitched. Porch lights flicked on. For the first time since the curfew started, the neighborhood came alive again, but not with people outside, only with faces pressed to windows. 2 squad cars rolled up, parking diagonally at the corner of the street. Their headlights bathed us in blinding white, and suddenly Karen's confidence seemed to shrink a size. She tried to straighten her blazer, tried to plaster on her fake community leader's smile, but her voice cracked as she hissed to her lackeys, "Let me do the talking." The officers stepped out, 2 men, both stone-faced, both with the kind of body language that said they'd seen it all before. Their hands rested near their belts, cautious but calm. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, scanning from me to Karen to the 3 so-called volunteers. Before I could speak, Karen leapt forward like she'd been waiting her whole life for this stage. "Officers," she cried, pointing at me dramatically. "This man is violent. He attacked my volunteers for no reason. He refused to obey community safety rules and then physically assaulted them." The 3 enforcers nodded in unison, like bobbleheads. The tall one even groaned and rubbed his ribs, pretending he was barely able to stand. I almost laughed at the performance. "My turn." "Actually," I said, stepping forward, "what really happened is that these men tried to assault me for walking outside after 8 o'clock. They shoved me, grabbed me, and one of them even tried to hit me with this." I pulled the confiscated flashlight from my hoodie pocket and held it up for the officers to see. The shorter officer tilted his head, eyebrow raised. "He swung this at you?" "Yes. And I defended myself. That's all." The taller officer turned his attention back to Karen. Can you explain why your volunteers were physically restraining this man for being outside?" Karen forced a laugh, but it came out high-pitched and nervous. "Because he was violating curfew, of course. The HOA board set a policy, No residents outside after 8 p.m. It's a matter of community safety. We're just doing what's best for everyone. The officers exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that said, "Is this lady for real?" The legal question. The shorter officer said carefully, "You understand that an HOA policy is not enforceable as law, right? You can't set a neighborhood-wide curfew and then physically enforce it. That would be illegal." Karen blinked rapidly, as though the words hadn't even registered. Illegal? No, you don't understand. I'm the HOA president. These rules are binding. Everyone signed agreements when they moved in. Binding for landscaping. For parking violations. For exterior paint colors maybe, the officer said flatly. Not for constitutional rights. You can't physically attack someone for standing outside their own home. Her face turned beet red. She sputtered like a kettle about to explode. But he hit them. He admitted it. That's assault. I stepped in quickly. I defended myself, after being shoved, grabbed, and swung at. That's self-defense, and I have the bruises to prove it. I lifted my sleeve, showing the fresh red mark on my forearm from blocking the flashlight strike. The officers leaned closer, inspecting the evidence. Their expressions hardened. Witnesses emerge. It was at that moment that the unexpected happened. A door creaked open down the street. Then another. Neighbors began to step out, hesitant at first, but once the sirens and flashing lights gave them a sense of safety, they shuffled forward. Officers. Mrs. Jensen, the elderly widow from 3 houses down, called out. I saw everything from my porch. He was just walking. Those men cornered him. Another neighbor chimed in from across the road. Yeah, I heard the shouting. They shoved him first. Everyone knows this curfew is nonsense. We've all been scared to go outside. Karen spun around, horrified. What are you doing? Get back inside. This doesn't concern you. But it was too late. One by one, more neighbors stepped closer, nodding in agreement, adding their voices to the truth. The officers turned back to me, their stance relaxing. Sounds like you've got quite a few witnesses backing up your version of events. I shrugged, keeping my voice calm. Like I said, I was just defending myself. Karen's desperation. Karen wasn't finished. She never was. This is harassment, she shrieked, stamping her heel against the pavement. These people are all conspiring against me, because they don't respect authority. I'm trying to keep them safe, and this is how they repay me. The tall officer finally lost patience. He held up a hand, silencing her mid-rant. I need you to calm down. Right now it looks like your volunteers committed assault. If you keep this up, you're going to make things worse for yourself. Karen froze, chest heaving, her face twisting between outrage and fear. For once, she didn't have a snappy comeback. The 3 enforcers, on the other hand, were already crumbling. The stocky one muttered something about just following orders. The skinny one looked ready to bolt. And the tall one, still holding his side dramatically, finally dropped the act when he realized the officers weren't buying it. Evidence sealed. The shorter officer gestured to the flashlight in my hand. We'll need to take that as evidence. I handed it over willingly. Be my guest. His fingerprints should still be on it. That sealed it. I could see the shift happen right in front of me, the way the officers now stood between me and Karen's crew, no longer treating this like a dispute between equals, but as an investigation into an attack. The taller officer spoke firmly. All right. Everyone involved will need to give a statement. Your volunteers may be facing charges for assault. Karen gasped like he'd just announced the apocalypse. Charges against them. They were protecting me. Protecting the neighborhood. He's the criminal here. Her voice cracked, desperation bleeding into every word. She was losing control, and she knew it. The calm before the storm. As the officers began separating us for statements, Karen's facade finally crumbled. She turned to her enforcers, whispering furiously, her voice low but still audible. You idiots. You were supposed to handle this quietly. Now look what you've done. The stocky one muttered, you told us to stop him. Her glare could have cut glass. Don't you dare pin this on me. I stood off to the side, watching the circus unravel. My knuckles still tingled from the scuffle, my adrenaline still buzzing. But deep down, a grim satisfaction settled in my chest. For once, Karen wasn't in control. The law was here. And the law wasn't on her side. The flashing blue and red lights painted the cul-de-sac in a surreal glow. Karen paced like a caged animal, muttering angrily while the officers separated us for statements. One of them pulled me aside, jotting notes on a clipboard. Walk me through it from the beginning, he said. I explained everything. How I had stepped outside at 8:01, how the enforcers had crossed the street, shoved me, grabbed me, and then how one tried to hit me with the flashlight. I kept my voice steady, clear, factual. No embellishments, no dramatics, just the truth. The officer nodded along, glancing occasionally at my bruised arm, then at the flashlight bagged as evidence. All right. And you only struck back after being attacked first. Correct. I defended myself, nothing more. When he finished, he gave a short nod. Sounds consistent with what your neighbors are saying. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone anymore. For months, everyone had been too afraid to stand up to Karen. But tonight, under the sirens, people had finally found their voices. Karen's spin. Across the street, the taller officer was trying to take Karen's statement, but she wasn't making it easy. This is outrageous, she screeched, arms flailing like a director of some chaotic play. That man has been nothing but trouble since the day he moved here. He mocks the rules, he disrespects the HOA, and now he's assaulting my volunteers. The officer interrupted, his tone cool and professional. Multiple witnesses saw your volunteers put their hands on him first. One of them even attempted to strike him with a flashlight. That's a lie, she shrieked. They're all against me. This whole neighborhood is conspiring, because they don't want to follow the rules. You don't understand, without order, everything falls apart. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic, desperate. But the harder she tried, the less convincing she became. The officer finally held up a hand. I need you to lower your voice. We've heard enough. The volunteers crack. Meanwhile, the so-called enforcers were crumbling under pressure. The stocky one, sweat dripping down his forehead, admitted quietly, look, we didn't mean for it to go that far. Karen told us to stop him. She said it was our duty. The skinny one chimed in nervously, I didn't touch him. I didn't want any part of it. I just followed along because she told us to. The tall one, the one who had shoved me first, still tried to keep his pride. But when the officer asked why his fingerprints would be on the flashlight, he had no answer. He just looked at the ground, jaw clenched. Piece by piece, their little story fell apart. The arrest. Finally, the taller officer squared his shoulders and delivered the verdict. Based on witness statements, physical evidence, and your own admissions, we have probable cause. Gentlemen, you're under arrest for assault. The three enforcers froze, their mouths dropping open in unison. Karen screamed. No. You can't arrest them. They are innocent. They were following my orders. The officer turned his gaze on her. Exactly. Which means you may be facing charges as well, for inciting this incident. We'll be contacting the district attorney's office about potential charges of conspiracy and harassment. Her face went ghost white. You wouldn't dare. The officer leaned in slightly, his voice firm. The law doesn't bend for HOA presidents. And with that, the enforcers were cuffed, their reflective vests looking more ridiculous than ever as they were marched toward the squad cars. The stocky one begged Karen to fix it. The skinny one whimpered about losing his job. The tall one muttered curses under his breath. Karen stood frozen, fists clenched at her sides, her empire crumbling before her eyes. The neighborhood awakens. As the police loaded the men into the cars, the neighbors stepped closer, cautious at first, then bolder. Mrs. Jensen, leaning on her cane, tapped Karen on the shoulder. You've been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, she said, her voice shaking with age but strong with conviction. Well, tonight's the end of it. Another neighbor added, we're done with your rules, Karen. No more curfews. No more threats. You've gone too far. A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. For the first time, people weren't whispering behind closed doors, they were standing openly against her. Karen spun in a circle, her eyes wide, looking for support. But all she saw were angry faces, disappointed stares, and people who'd finally had enough. You're all ungrateful, she screeched. I gave order to this community. Without me, you'd have chaos. No, I said quietly, stepping forward. Without you, we'll finally have peace. Aftermath. The officers wrapped up their notes, promising to follow up with each of us for formal statements. They gave me a final nod of reassurance. You did the right thing calling us. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. As the squad cars pulled away, taking the enforcers with them, Karen was left standing alone on the sidewalk, her empire in ruins. She tried to regain some dignity, straightening her blazer, muttering that this was all a misunderstanding, and that she would sue everyone involved. But no one listened. The neighbors turned their backs on her and drifted home, whispering plans to hold a community vote to strip her of her title. I lingered a little longer, taking in the sight of the empty street. For the first time in weeks, it felt alive again, not with fear, but with the promise of change. I looked up at the glowing streetlight, breathed in the cool night air and smiled. It was 10:30 p.m. And I was outside. Epilogue. In the days that followed, word spread fast. The HOA's curfew rule was officially nullified. Karen faced an emergency vote of no confidence, and though she fought tooth and nail, she was stripped of her position. Rumor had it that her enforcers were each facing misdemeanor assault charges, with the potential for fines and probation. But the real victory wasn't the legal battle. It was the fact that the neighborhood had finally woken up. People no longer cowered when Karen barked orders. They no longer treated her HOA rules as if they were law. For the first time in years, kids played in the streets after dark. Neighbors hosted cookouts without fear of citations. People walked their dogs at night without looking over their shoulders. And me. I just enjoyed my freedom. Every evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a point to step outside, sometimes just to stand in the yard, sometimes to stroll the block. It wasn't about the walk. It was about the principle. Because no self-appointed tyrant, no matter how loud or bossy, was ever going to take away my right to live free on my own property. And every time I did, I thought back to that night, and I smiled. Because that was the night the HOA's grip broke, and the community finally got its life back.